Chapter 14 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Suddenly, as Courtland stood in the narrow, dark street alone and in uncertainty, he was no longer alone. As clearly as if he felt a touch upon his sleeve, he knew that One was there beside him, and that this errand he was upon had the sanction of that Presence which had met him once in the fiery way and promised to show him what to do. "God, show me where to find her!" he ejaculated, and then, as if one had said, "Come with me," he turned as certainly as if a passer-by had directed him where he had seen her, and walked up the street. That is, they walked up the street. Always in thinking of that walk afterward, he thought of it as they walking up the street, himself and the Presence. The first thing he remembered about it was that he had lost that sense of uncertainty and anxiety. How long the route was or where it was to end did not seem to matter. Every step of the way was accompanied by One who knew what he was about. It came to him that he would like to go everywhere in such company, that no journey would be too far or arduous, no duty too unpleasant, if all could be as this. He stepped into the telephone office and began calling up hospitals. There were one or two that reported young women brought in, but the description was not at all like the girl of whom he was in search. He jotted them down in his note book, however, with a feeling that they might be a last resort. As he turned the pages of the phone book his eye caught the name of the city's morgue, and a sudden horror froze into his mind. What if something had happened to her and she had been taken there? What if she had ended the life which had looked so lonely and impossible to her? No, she would never do that, not with her faith in the Christ. And yet, if her vitality was low and her heart was taxed with sorrow, she would perhaps scarcely be responsible for what she did. He rang up the morgue sharply and put tense, eager questions. Yes, a young woman had been brought in about an hour ago. Yes, dressed in black, had long, light hair, and was slender. Some looker, the man who answered the phone said. Courtland shuddered and hung up. He felt that he must go to the morgue. When they entered the gruesome place of the unknown dead, although the Presence entered with him, yet he felt that it was there already, standing close among the dead, had been there when they came in. Courtland's face was white and set as he passed between the silent dead laid out for identification. An inward shudder went through him as he was led to the spot where lay the latest comer, a slim young girl with long golden hair, sodden from the river where she had been found, her pretty face sharpened and coarsened by sin. He drew a deep breath of relief and turned away quickly from the sight of her poor drowned eyes, rejoicing that they had not been the eyes of Bonnie. It was terrible to think of Bonnie lying so, all drenched and her spirit put out. He was glad he might still think of her alive and go on searching for her. But a dart of pain went through his heart as he looked again at this little wreck of womanhood, going out of a life that had dealt hardly with her, where she had reached for brightness and pleasure and had found ashes and bitterness instead, going into a beyond of darkness, hoping perhaps for no kindlier hands to greet her than those that had been withheld from her in this world. What would the resurrection mean to a poor little soul like that? What could it mean? Ah, perhaps it had not all been her fault. Perhaps there were others who had helped push her down, smug in self-righteousness, to whom the resurrection would be more of a horror than to the pretty ignorant child whose untaught feet had strayed into forbidden paths. Who knew? He was glad to look up and feel the Presence there. Who knew what might have passed between the soul and God? It was safe to leave that little sinful soul with Him who had died to save it. It was good to go out from there knowing that the pretty sinful girl, the hardened, grizzled sot, the poor old toothless crone, the little hunchback newsboy who lay in the same row, were guarded alike and beloved by the same Presence that would go with him. Around the little newsboy huddled a group of street gamins, counting out their few pennies and talking excitedly of how they would buy him some flowers. There were tear stains down their grimy cheeks, and it was plain they were pitying him, they who had perhaps yet to tread the paths of sin and deprivation and sorrow for many long years. And the Presence there, so near them with the pitying eyes. The young man knew the eyes were pitying. If the children could only see! He felt an impulse to turn back and tell them as he passed out into the street. Yet how could he make them understand? He who understood so feebly and intermittently himself. He felt a great ache in himself to go out and shout to all the world to look up and see the Presence that was in their midst. And they saw him not. He was entirely aware that his present mental state would have seemed to him little short of insanity 24 hours before, that it might pass again as it had done before, and a kind of mental frenzy seized him lest it would. He did not want to lose this assurance of one guiding through a world that was so full of sorrow as this one had recently revealed itself to him to be. And with the world-old anguished "Give me a sign," the cry of the soul reaching out to the unknown, he spoke aloud once more: "God, if you are really there, let me find her!" And yet, if any had asked him just then if he ever prayed, he would have told them no. Prayer was to him a thing utterly apart from this cry of his soul, this longing for an understanding with God. He walked on through streets he did not know, passing men and women with worn and haggard faces, tattered garments, and discouraged mien, and always that cry came in his soul: "Oh, if they only knew!" There was the Presence by his side, and men passed by and saw him not. He was walking in the general direction of the Good Samaritan Hospital, just as any one would walk with a friend through a strange place and accommodate his going to the man who was guiding him. All the way there seemed to be a sort of intercourse between himself and his companion. His soul was putting forth great questions that he would some day take up in detail and go over little by little, as one will verify a problem that one has worked out. But now he was working it out, becoming satisfied in his soul that this was the only way to solve the great otherwise unanswerable problems of the universe. They had gone for perhaps 3 miles or more from the morgue, traveling for the most part through narrow streets crowded full of small dwelling houses, interspersed by cheap stores and saloons. The night lowered. The stars were not on duty. A cold wind from the river swept around corners, reminding him of the dripping yellow hair of the girl in the morgue. It cut like a knife through Courtland's heavy overcoat and made him wish he had brought his muffler. He stuffed his gloved hands into his pockets. Even in their fur linings they were stiff and cold. He thought of the girl's little light serge jacket and shivered visibly as they turned into another street where vacant lots on one side left a wide sweep for the wind and sent it tempesting along, freighted with dust and stinging bits of sand. The clouds were heavy as with snow, only that it was too cold to snow. One fancied only biting steel could fall from clouds like that on a night so bitter. And any moment he might have turned back, gone a block to one side, and caught the trolley across to the university, where light and warmth and friends were waiting. And what was this one little lost girl to him? A stranger? No, she was no longer a stranger. She had become something infinitely precious to the whole universe. God cared, and that was enough. He could not be a friend of God unless he cared as God cared. He was demonstrating facts that he had never apprehended before. The lights were out in most of the houses that they passed, for it was growing late. There were not quite so many saloons. The streets loomed wide ahead, the line of houses dark on the left, and the stretch of vacant lots, with the river beyond on the right. Across the river a line of dark buildings with occasional blink of lights blended into the dark of the sky, and the wind merciless over all. On ahead a couple of blocks the light flung out on the pavement and marked another saloon. Bright doors swung back and forth, the intermittent throb of a piano and twang of a violin making merry with the misery of the world. Voices brokenly above it all came at intervals, loudly, as the way drew nearer. The saloon doors swung open again and 4 or 5 dark figures jostled noisily out and came haltingly down the street. They walked crazily, like ships without a rudder, veering from one side of the walk to the other, shouting and singing uncouth, ribald songs, hoarse laughter interspersed with scattered oaths. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" came distinctly through the quiet night. The young man felt a distinct pain for the Christ by his side, like the pressing of a thorn into the brow. He seemed to know the prick himself, for these were some of those for whom he died. It occurred to Courtland that he was seeing everything on this walk through the eyes of the Christ. He remembered Scrooge and his journey with the ghost of Christmas past in Dickens' Christmas Carol. It was like that. He was seeing the real soul of everybody. He was with the architect of the universe, noting where the work had gone wrong from the mighty plans. He suddenly knew that these creatures coming giddily toward him were planned to mighty things. The figures paused before one of the dark houses, pointed and laughed, went nearer to the steps and stooped. He could not hear what they were saying. The voices were hushed in ugly whispers, broken by harsh laughter. Only now and then he caught a syllable. "Wake up!" floated out into the silence once, and again, "No, you don't, my pretty little chicken!" Then a girl's scream pierced the night, and something darted out from the darkness of the doorstep, eluding the drunken men, but slipped and fell. Courtland broke into a noiseless run. The men had scrambled tipsily after the girl and clutched her. They lifted her unsteadily and surrounded her. She screamed again and dashed this way and that blindly, but they met her every time and held her. Courtland knew, as by a flash, that he had been brought here for this crisis. It was as if he had heard the words spoken to him, "Now go!" He, lowering his head and crouching, came swiftly forward, watching carefully where he steered, and coming straight at 2 of the men with his powerful shoulders. It was an old trick of the football field, and it bowled the 2 assailants on the right straight out into the gutter. The other 3 made a dash at him, but he sidestepped one and tripped him. A blow on the point of the chin sent another sprawling on the sidewalk. But the last one, who was perhaps the most sober of them all, showed fight and called to his comrades to come on and get this stranger who was trying to steal their girl. The language he used made Courtland's blood boil. He struck the fellow across his foul mouth, and then, clinching with him, went down upon the sidewalk. His antagonist was a heavier man than he was, but the steady brain and the trained muscles had the better of it from the first, and in a moment more the drunken man was choking and limp. Courtland rose and looked about. The 2 fellows in the gutter were struggling to their feet with loud threats, and the fellow on the sidewalk was staggering toward him. They would be upon the girl again in a moment. He looked toward her as she stood trembling, a few feet away from him, too frightened to try to run, not daring to leave her protector. A street light fell directly upon her white face. It was Bonnie Brentwood! With a kick at the man on the ground who was trying to rise, and a lurch at the man on the sidewalk who was coming toward him that sent him spinning again, Courtland dived under the clutching hands of the 2 in the gutter who couldn't quite make it to get upon the curb again. Snatching up the girl like a baby, he fled up the street and around the first corner, and all that cursing, drunken, reeling 5 came howling after. End of chapter 14. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 15 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Courtland had run 3 blocks and turned 2 corners before he dared stop and set the girl upon her feet again. He looked anxiously at her white face and great frightened eyes. Her lips were trembling and she was shivering. He tore his overcoat off, wrapped it about her, and before she could protest, caught her up again and ran on another block or 2. "Oh, you must not!" she cried. "I can walk perfectly well, and I don't need your coat. Please, please, put on your coat and let me walk. You will take a terrible cold." "I can run better without it," he explained briefly, and we can get out of the way of those fellows quicker this way." So she lay still in his arms till he put her down again. He looked up and down either way, hoping to see the familiar red and green lights of a drug store open late, but none greeted him, and all the buildings seemed to be residences. Somewhere in the distance he heard the whir of a late trolley. He glanced at his watch. It was 1:30. If only a taxicab would come along, but no taxi was in sight. The girl was begging him to put on his overcoat. She had drawn it from her own shoulders and was holding it out to him insistently, but with the rare smile that Courtland was noted for, he took the coat and wrapped it firmly about her shoulders again, this time putting her arms in the sleeves and buttoning it up to the chin. "Now," said he, "you're not to take that off again until we get where it is warm. You needn't worry about me. I'm quite used to going out in all weathers without my coat as often as with it. Besides, I've been exercising. When did you have something to eat?" "When I left the hospital this evening. I had some strong beef tea," she answered airily, as if that had been only a few minutes before. "How did you happen to be where I found you?" he asked, looking at her keenly. "Why, I must have missed my way, I think," she explained, "and I felt a little weak from having been in bed so long. I just sat down on a doorstep to rest a minute before I went on, and I'm afraid I must have fallen asleep." "You were walking?" His tone was stern. "Why were you walking?" A desperate look came into her face. "Well, I hadn't any car fare, if you must know the reason." They were passing a street light as she said it, and he looked down at her fine little white profile in wonder and awe. He felt a sudden choking in his throat and a mist in his eyes. He had it on the tip of his tongue to say, "You poor little girl," but instead he said, in a tone of intense admiration, "Well, you certainly are the pluckiest girl I ever saw. You have your nerve with you, all right, but you're not going to walk another step to night." And with that he stooped, gathered her up again, and strode forward. He could hear the distant whir of another trolley, and he determined to take it, no matter which way it was going. It would take them somewhere, and he could telephone for an ambulance. So he sprinted forward, regardless of her protests, and arrived at the next corner just in time to catch the car going cityward. There was nobody else in the car, and he made her keep the coat about her. He couldn't help seeing how worn and thin her little shabby shoes were, and how she shivered now even in the great coat. He saw she was just keeping up her nerve, and he was filled with admiration. "Why did you run away from the hospital?" he asked, suddenly, looking straight into her sad eyes. "I couldn't afford to stay any longer." "You made a big mistake. It wouldn't have cost you a cent. That room was free. I made sure of that before I secured it for you." "But that was a private room." "Just a little more private than the wards. That room was paid for and put at the disposal of the doctor to use for whoever he thought needed quiet. Now are you satisfied? Are you going straight back there till you are well enough to go out again? You raised a big row in the hospital running away. They've had the whole force of assistants out hunting you for hours, and your nurse is awfully upset about you. She seems to be crazy over you, anyway. She nearly wept when she telephoned me. And I've been out for hours hunting you, stirred up the old lady on your floor at your home, and a lot of hospitals and other places, and then just came on you in the nick of time. I hope you've learned your lesson to be a good little girl after this and not run away." He smiled indulgently, but the girl's eyes were full of tears. "I didn't mean to make all that trouble for people. Why should you all care about a stranger? But oh, I'm so thankful you came. Those men were terrible!" she shuddered. "How did you happen to come? I think God must have led you there." "He did," said Courtland with conviction. When they reached the big city station he stowed his patient into a taxi and sent a messenger up to the restaurant for hot chicken broth, which he administered himself. She lay back with her eyes closed after the broth was finished. He realized that she had reached the full limit of her endurance. She had forgotten even to protest against wearing his overcoat any longer. It was a strange ride. The silent girl sat closely wrapped in her corner, fast asleep. The car bounded over obstacles now and then, or swung around corners and threw her about like a ball, but she did not waken. And finally Courtland drew her head down upon his shoulder and put his arm about her to keep her from being thrown out of her seat, and she settled down like a tired child. He could not help thinking of that other girl lying stark and dead in the morgue, and being glad that this one was safe. Nurse Wright was hovering about the hallway when the taxi drew up to the entrance of the hospital, and Bonnie was tenderly cared for at once. Courtland began to realize that this great hospital was an evidence of the presence of Christ in the world. He was not the only one who had felt the presence. Someone moved as he had been to night had established this big house of healing. There on the opposite wall was a great stained glass window representing Christ blessing the little children, and the people bringing the maimed and halt and lame and blind to Him for healing. The quiet night routine went on about him. The strong, pervasive odor of antiseptics, the padded tap of the nurses' rubber soles as they went softly on their rounds, the occasional click of a glass and a spoon somewhere, the piteous wail of a suffering child in a distant ward, the sharp whir of an electric bell, the homely thud of the elevator on its errands up and down, even the controlled yet ready spring to service of all concerned when the ambulance rolled up and a man on a stretcher with a ghastly cut in his head and face was brought in, all made him feel how little and useless his life had been hitherto, how suddenly he had been brought face to face with realities. He began to wonder if the Presence was everywhere, or if there were places where His power was not manifest. There had been the Red Library. There also had been that church last Sunday. The office clock chimed softly out the hour of 3 o'clock. It was Sunday morning. Should he go to church again and search for the Presence, or make up his mind that the churches were out of it entirely, and that it was only in places of need and sorrow and suffering that He came? Still, that was not fair to the churches, perhaps, to judge all by one. What an experience the night had been! Did Whitmore, majoring in philanthropy, ever spend nights like this? If so, there must be depths to Whitmore's nature that were worth sounding. He drew his handkerchief from his inner pocket. As he did so a whiff of violets came remindingly, but he paid no heed. Gila's letter lay in his pocket still unread. The antiseptics were at work upon his senses, and the violets could not reach him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was in a tumble, but he looked good to Nurse Wright as she came down the hall at last to give him her report. She almost thought he was good enough for her Bonnie girl now. She wasn't given to romances, but she felt that Bonnie needed one most mightily about now. She didn't wake up except to open her eyes and smile once, she reported reassuringly. She coughs a little now and then with a nasty sound in it, but I hope we can ward off pneumonia. It was great of you to put your overcoat around her. That saved her, if anything can, I guess. You look pretty well used up yourself. Wouldn't you like the doctor to give you something before you go home? No, thank you. I'll be all right. I'm hard as nails. I'm only anxious about her. You see, she's had a pretty tough pull of it. She started to walk to the city. Did you know that? I fancy she'd gone about 2 miles. It was somewhere along near the river I found her. It seems she got all in and sat down on a doorstep to rest. She must have fallen asleep. Some tough fellows came out of a saloon. They were full, of course, and they discovered her. I heard her scream, and we had quite a little scuffle before we got away. She's a nervy little girl. Think of her starting to walk to the city at that time of night without a cent in her pocket. The poor child, said Nurse Wright with tears in her kind, keen eyes. And she left her last cent here to pay for her room. My! When I think of it I could choke that smart young snob that called on her in the afternoon. You ought to have heard her sneers and insinuations. Women like that are a blight on womanhood. And she dared to mention your name. Said you had sent her. The color heightened in Courtland's face. He felt uncomfortable. Why, I didn't exactly send her, he began uneasily. I don't really know her very well. You see, I'm just a student at the university, and of course I don't know a great many girls in the city. I thought it would be nice if some girl would call on Miss Brentwood. She seemed so alone. I thought another girl would understand and be able to comfort her. She isn't a girl. That's what's the matter with her. She's a little demon, snapped the nurse. You meant well, and I dare say she never showed you the demon side of her, Girls like that don't to young men. But if you take my advice you won't have anything more to do with her. She isn't worth it. She may be rich and fashionable and all that, but she can't hold a candle to Miss Brentwood. If you had just heard how she went on with her nasty little chin in the air and her nasty phrases and insinuations and her patronage! And then Miss Brentwood's gentle, refined way of answering her. But never mind. I won't go into that. It might take me all night and I've got to get back to my patient. But you are not to blame yourself one particle. I hope Miss Brentwood's going to get through this all right in a few days, and she'll probably have forgotten all about it, so don't you worry. I think it would be a good thing if you were to come in and see her to morrow afternoon a few minutes. It might cheer her up. You really have been fine, you know. No telling where she might have been by this time if you hadn't gone out after her. The young man shuddered involuntarily and thought of the faces of the 5 young fellows who had surrounded her. I saw a little girl in the morgue to night drowned, he said irreverently. She wasn't any older than Miss Brentwood. The nurse gave an understanding look. On her way back to her rounds she said to herself, I believe he's a real man. If I hadn't thought so I wouldn't have told him he might come and see her to morrow. Then she went into Bonnie's room, took the letter with the Western postmark, and stood it up against a medicine glass on the little table beside the bed, where Bonnie could see it the first thing when she opened her eyes. End of chapter 15. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 16 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A little after 4 o'clock, when Courtland came plodding up the hall of the dormitory to his room, a head was stuck out of Tennelly's door, followed by Tennelly's shoulders attired in a bathrobe. The hair on the head was much tumbled and the eyes were full of sleep. Moreover, there was an anxious, relieved frown on the brows. Where in thunder've you been, Court? We were thinking of dragging the river for you. I must say you're the limit. Do you know what time it is? 5 minutes after 4 by the library clock as I came up, answered Court affably. Say, Nellie, go to church with me again this morning? I've found another preacher I want to sample. Go to thunder, growled Tennelly. Not on your tintype. I'm going to get some sleep. What do you take me for? A night nurse? Go to church when I've been up all night hunting for you. Sorry, Nellie, said Courtland cheerfully, but it was an emergency call. Tell you all about it on the way to church. Church don't begin till somewhere round 11. You'll be calm by that time. So long. See you in church. Tennelly slammed his door hard, and Courtland went smiling to his room. He knew that Tennelly would go with him to church, for Courtland had seen among the advertisements in the trolley on his way back to the university the notice of a service to be held in a church away down in the lower part of the city, to be addressed by the Reverend John Burns, and he wanted to go. It might not be the John Burns, of course, but he wanted to see. Worn out with the events of the night, he slept soundly until 10. Then, as if he had been an alarm clock set for a certain moment, he awoke. He lay there for a moment in the peace of the consciousness of something good that had come to him. Then he knew that it was the Presence. It was there, in his room. It would always be his. There might be laws attending its coming and going, perhaps in some way concerned with his own attitude, but he would learn them. It was enough to know the possibility of that companionship all the days of one's life. He couldn't reason out why a thing like that should give him so much joy. It didn't seem sensible in the old way of reasoning, and yet didn't it? If it could be proved to the fellows that there was really a God like that, companionable, reasonable, just, loving, forgiving, ready to give himself, wouldn't every one of them jump at the chance of knowing him personally, provided there was a way for them to know him? They claimed it had never been proved, never could be. But he knew it could. It had been proved to him. That was the difference. That was the greatness of it. And now he was going to church again to find out if the Presence was ever there. With a bound he was out of bed, shaved and dressed in an incredibly short space of time, and shouting to Tennelly, who took his feet reluctantly from the window seat, lowered the Sunday paper, and replied sulkily, "Thunder and blazes! Who waked you up, you nut? I thought you were good for another 2 hours." But they went to church. Tennelly sat down on the hard wooden bench and accepted the worn hymn book that a small urchin presented him, with an amused stare which finally bloomed into a full grin at Courtland. "What's eating you, you blooming idiot? Where in thunder did you rake up this dump, anyway? If you've got to go to church, why in the name of all that's a bore can't you pick out a place where the congregation take a bath once a month, whether they need it or not?" he whispered in a loud growl. But Courtland's eyes were already fixed on the bright, intelligent face and red hair of the man who stood behind the cheap little pulpit. He was the same John Burns. A window just behind the platform, set with crude red and blue and yellow lights of cheap glass, sent its radiance down upon his head, and the yellow bar lay across his hair like a halo. Behind him, in the colored lights, there seemed to stand the Presence. It was so vivid to Courtland at first that he drew in his breath and looked sharply at Tennelly, as if he, too, must see, though he knew there was nothing visible, of course, but the lights, the glory, and the little freckled, earnest man giving out a hymn. And the singing! If one were looking for discord, well, it was there, every shade of it that the world had ever known. There were quavering old voices and piping young ones, off the key and on the key, squeaking, grating, screaming, howling, with all their earnest might. But the melody lifted itself in a great voice on high and seemed to bear along the spirit of the congregation. "I need thee every hour, stay thou near by. Temptations lose their power when thou art nigh. I need thee, oh, I need thee, every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior, I come to thee." These people, then, knew about the Presence, loved it, longed for it, understood its power. They sang of the Presence and were glad. There were, then, others in the world who knew, besides himself and Stephen Marshall's mother. Without knowing what he was doing, Courtland sang. He did not know the words, but he felt the spirit, and he groped along in syllables as he caught them. Tennelly sat gazing around him, highly amused, not attempting to suppress his mirth. His eyes fairly danced as he observed first one absorbed worshiper and then another, intent upon the song. He fancied himself taking off the old elder on the other side of the aisle, and the intense young woman with the large mouth and the feather in her hat. Her voice was killing. He could make the fellows die laughing, singing as she did, in a high falsetto. He looked at Courtland to enjoy it with him, and lo! Courtland was singing with as much earnestness as the rest, and upon his face there sat a high, exalted look that he had never seen there before. Was it truly that the fire and the sickness had really affected Court's mind, after all? He had seemed so like his old self lately that they had all hoped he was getting over it. During the prayer Courtland dropped his head and closed his eyes. Tennelly glanced around and marveled amusedly at the serious attitude of all. Even a row of tough-looking kids on the back seats had at least one eye apiece squinted shut during the prayer, and almost an atmosphere of reverence upon them. Tennelly prided himself upon being a student of human nature, and before he knew it he was interested in this mass of common people about him. But now and again his gaze went uneasily back to Courtland, whose eyes were fixed intently upon the preacher, as if the words he spoke were of real importance to him. Tennelly sat back in wonder and tried to listen. It was all about a mysterious companionship with God, stuff that sounded like rot to him, uncanny, unreal, mystical, impossible. Could it be true that Court, their peach of a Court, whose sneer and criticism alike had been dreaded by all who came beneath them, could it be that so sensible and scholarly and sane a mind as Court's could take up with a superstition like that? For it was to Tennelly foolishness. He owned to a certain amount of interest in the emotional side of the sermon. It was true that the little man could sway that uncouth audience mightily. He felt himself swayed in the tenderer side of his nature. But of course his superior mind realized that it was all emotion, interesting as a study, but not to be taken seriously for a moment. It wasn't a healthy thing for Court to see much of this sort of thing. All this talk of a cross and one dying for all. Mere foolishness and superstition. Very beautiful and perhaps allegorical, but not at all practical. The minister was down by the door before they got out, and grasped Courtland's hand as if he were an old friend, and then turned and grasped Tennelly's. There was something so genuine and sincere about his face that Tennelly decided that he must really believe all that junk he had been preaching after all. He wasn't a fake. He was merely a good, wholesome sort of a fanatic. He bowed pleasantly and said a few commonplaces as he passed out. "Seems to be a good sort," he murmured to Courtland. "Pity he's tied down to that sort of thing." Courtland looked at him sharply. "Is that the way you feel about it, Nellie?" There was something half wistful in his tone. Tennelly looked at him sharply. "Why, sure! I think he's a bigger man than his job, don't you?" "Then you didn't feel it?" "Feel what?" "The presence of God in that place." There was something so simple and majestic about the way Courtland made the extraordinary statement, not as a common fanatic would make it, nor even as one who was testing and feeling around for confirmation of a hope, but as one who knew it to be a fact beyond questioning, which the other merely hadn't been able to see, that Tennelly was almost embarrassed. "Why, no, I can't say that I noticed any particular manifestation. I was entirely too much taken up by the smell to observe the occult. Say, what's eating you anyway, Court? Such foolishness isn't like you. You ought to cut it out. You know a thing like this can get on your nerves if you let it, just like anything else, and make you a monomaniac. You ought to go in for more athletics and cut out some of your psychology and philosophy. Suppose we go and take a ride in the park this afternoon. It's a great day." "I don't mind riding in the park for a while after dinner. I've got a date about 4 o'clock. But I'm not a monomaniac, Nellie, and nothing's getting on my nerves. I never felt better or happier in my life. I feel as if I'd been blind always, been sort of groping my way, and had just got my eyes open to see what a wonderful thing life really is." "Do you mean you've got what they used to call religion, Court? Hit the trail, as it were?" Tennelly asked, as if he were delicately inquiring about some insidious tubercular or cancerous trouble. He seemed half ashamed to connect such a perilous possibility with his honored friend. Courtland shook his head. "Not that I know of, Nellie. I never attended one of those big evangelistic meetings in my life, and I don't know exactly what religion, as they call it, is, so I can't lay claim to anything of that sort. What I mean is, simply I've met God face to face and found He's my friend. That's about the size of it, and it makes things all look different. I'd like to tell you about it just as it happened sometime, Tennelly, when you're ready to hear." "Wait a while, Court," said Tennelly, half shrinking. "Wait till you've had a little more time to think it over. Then, if you like, I'll listen." "Very well," said Courtland, quietly. "But I want you to know it's something real. It's no sick fancies." "All right," said Tennelly. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to hear." Late that afternoon, when Courtland entered the hospital, the sunshine was flooding the great stained glass window and glorifying the face of the Christ with the outstretched hands. Off in a near by ward some one was singing to the patients, and the corridors seemed hushed to listen. "The healing of the seamless dress is by our beds of pain. We touch Him in life's throng and press, and we are whole again." All this recognition of the Christ in the world, and somehow it had never come to his consciousness before. He felt abashed at his blindness. And if he had been so long, surely there was hope for Tennelly to see too. Somehow he wanted Tennelly to see. End of chapter 16. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 17 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bonnie Brentwood was awake and expecting him, the nurse said. She lay propped up by pillows, draped about with a dainty frilly dressing sock that looked too frivolous for Nurse Wright, yet could surely have come from no other source. The golden hair was lying in two long braids, one over each shoulder, and there was a faint flush of expectancy on her pale cheeks. "You have been so good to me," she said. "It has been wonderful for a stranger to go out of his way so much." "Please let's don't talk about that," said Courtland. "It's been only a pleasure to be of service. Now I want to know how you are. I've been expecting to hear that you had pneumonia or something dreadful after that awful exposure." "Oh, I've been through a good deal more than that," said the girl, trying to speak lightly. "Things don't seem to kill me. I've had quite a lot of hard times." "I'm afraid you have," he said gravely. "Somehow it doesn't seem fair that you should have had such a rotten time of it, and I be lying around enjoying myself. Shouldn't everybody be treated alike in this world? I confess I don't understand it." Bonnie smiled feebly. "Oh, it's all right," she said with conviction. "In the world ye shall have tribulation, but fear not. I have overcome the world, you know. It's our testing time, and this world isn't the only part of life." "Well, I don't see how that answers my point," said Courtland pleasantly. "What's the idea? Don't you think I am worth the testing?" "Oh, surely, but you may not need the same kind I did." "You don't appear to me to have needed any testing. So far as I can judge, you've showed the finest kind of nerve on every occasion." "Oh, but I do," said Bonnie earnestly. "I've needed it dreadfully. You don't know how hard I was getting, sort of soured on the world. That was the reason I came away from the old home where my father's church was, and where all the people I knew were. I couldn't bear to see them. They had been so hard on my dear father that I thought they were the cause of his death. I had begun to feel that there weren't any real Christians left in the world. God has to bring me away off here into trouble again to find out how good people are. He sent you to help me, and Nurse Wright. And now, to day, the most wonderful thing has happened. I've had a letter from an utter stranger asking me to come and visit. I want you to read it, please." While Courtland read Mother Marshall's letter, Bonnie lay studying him. And truly he was a goodly sight. No girl in her senses could look at a man like that over and not know he was a man, and a fine one. But Bonnie had no romantic thoughts. Life had dealt too hardly with her for her to have any illusions left. She had no idea of her own charms, nor any thought of making much of the situation. That was why Gila's insinuations had cut so terribly deep. "She's a peach, isn't she?" he said, handing the letter back. "How soon does the doctor think you'll be able to travel?" "Oh, I couldn't possibly go," said the girl, relapsing into sadness. "But I think it was lovely of her." "Go? Of course you must go!" cried Courtland, springing to his feet, as if he had been accustomed to manage this girl's affairs for years. "Why, Mother Marshall would be just broken hearted if you didn't." "Mother Marshall!" exclaimed Bonnie, sitting up from her pillows in astonishment. "You know her, then?" Courtland stopped suddenly in his excited march across the room and laughed ruefully. "Well, I've let the cat out of the bag after all, haven't I? Yes, then, I know her. It was I who told her about you, and I had a letter from her 2 days ago saying she was crazy to have you come. Why, she's just counting the minutes till she gets your telegram. You haven't sent her word you aren't coming, have you?" "Not yet," said Bonnie. "I was going to ask you what would be the best way to do. You see, I have to send back that money and the mileage. Don't you think it would do to write? It costs a great deal to telegraph, and sounds so abrupt when one has had such a royal invitation. It was lovely of her. But of course you know I couldn't be under obligation like that to entire strangers." There was a little stiffness in Bonnie's last words, and a cool withdrawal in her eyes that brought Courtland to his senses and made him remember Gila's insinuations. "Look here," he said, calming down and taking his chair again. "You don't understand, and I guess I ought to explain. In the first place, get it out of your head that I'm acting fresh or anything like that.
I'm only a kind of big brother that happened along 2 or 3 times when you needed somebody. A a kind of a Christ brother, if you want to call it that way," he added, snatching at the minister's phrase. "You believe he sends help when it's needed, don't you?" Bonnie nodded. "Well, I hadn't an idea in the world of interfering with your affairs at all, but when I heard you ought to rest, I began to wish I had a mother of my own, or an aunt or something who would know what to advise. Then all of a sudden I thought I'd just put the case up to Mother Marshall. This is the result. Now wait till I tell you what Mother Marshall has been through, and then if you don't decide that God sent that invitation I've nothing else to say." Courtland had a reputation at college for eloquence. In rushing season his frat always counted on him to bowl over the doubtful and difficult fellows, and he never failed. Neither did he fail now, although he found Bonnie difficult enough. But he had her eyes full of tears of sympathy before he was through with the story of Stephen. "Oh, I would love to see her and put my arms around her and try to comfort her!" she exclaimed. "I know just how she must feel, but I really couldn't use the money of a stranger, and I couldn't go away with all this debt, the funeral and everything." Then he set carefully to work to plan for her. He read Mother Marshall's letter over again and asked what things she would need to take if she should go. He wrote out a list of the things she would like to sell and promised to look after them. "Suppose you just leave that to me," he said, comfortingly. "I'll wager I can get enough out of your furniture to pay all the bills so you won't leave any behind. Then, if I were you, I'd just use that check they've sent for your expenses and trust to getting a position in that neighborhood when you are strong enough. There are always openings in the West, you know." "Do you really think I could do that?" asked Bonnie, excitedly. "I'm a good stenographer. I've had really fine musical education, and I could teach a number of other things." "Oh, sure! You'd get more positions than you could fill at once!" he declared, joyously. Somehow it gave him great pleasure to be succeeding so well. "Then I could soon pay them back," said Bonnie, reflectively. "Sure! You could pay back in no time after you got strong. That would be a cinch. It might even be that you could help Mother Marshall about something in the house pretty soon. And I'm sure you'll find she just needs you. Now suppose we write up that telegram. There's no need to keep the dear lady waiting any longer." "He thinks I really ought to go," said Bonnie to the nurse who had just returned. "Didn't I tell you so, dear?" said the nurse. "How soon would the doctor let her travel?" asked Courtland. "Why, I'll go ask him. You want to put it in your message, don't you?" "She's a dear," said Bonnie, with a tender look after her. "Isn't she a peach?" seconded Courtland, enthusiastically. The nurse was back almost at once, reporting that Bonnie might travel by the middle of the week if all went well. "But could I get ready to go so soon?" said the girl, a shade of trouble coming into her eyes. "I must go back and pack up my things, you know, and clean the room." Courtland and the nurse exchanged meaningful glances. "Now look here," began Courtland with an engaging smile. "Why couldn't the nurse and I do all that's necessary? How about to morrow afternoon? Could you get off a while, Miss Wright? I don't have any basket ball practice till Tuesday, and I could get off right after dinner. Miss Brentwood, you could tell the nurse just what you want done with your things, and I'll warrant she and I have sense enough to pack up one little room." After some persuasion Bonnie half consented, and then they attended to the telegram. "Your wonderful invitation accepted with deep gratitude. Will start as soon as able. Probably Wednesday night. Will write. Rose Bonner Brentwood," was what they finally evolved. Bonnie had been divided between a desire to save words and a longing to show her appreciation of the kindness. But the strangest thing of all was that, in his eagerness, the paper Courtland fumbled out from his pocket to write it upon was Gila Dare's unopened letter reeking with violets. He frowned as he realized it and stuffed it back in his pocket again. Courtland enjoyed sending that telegram. He enjoyed it so much that he sent another along with it on his own account, which read: "3 cheers for the best mother in the United States. She's coming, and you ought to see her eyes shine." It was on the way back to the university that he happened to remember Gila's letter. End of chapter 17. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana.
Chapter 18 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My dear Mr. Courtland, the very first line translated Courtland into another world from the one in which he had been living during the past 3 days. Its perfumed breath struck harshly on his soul. I am writing to report on the case of the poor girl whom you asked me to help. I was very anxious to please you and did my best, but you remember that I warned you that persons of that sort were likely to be most difficult and ungrateful, indeed, quite impossible sometimes, and so, perhaps, you will be somewhat prepared for the disappointing report I have to give. I went to the hospital this afternoon, putting off several engagements to do so. I was quite surprised to find the girl in a private room, but of course your kindness made that possible for her, which makes her utter ingratitude all the more unpardonable. I took with me several very pretty frocks of my own, quite good, some of them scarcely worn at all, for I know girls of that sort care more for clothes than anything else. But I found her quite sullen and disagreeable. She wouldn't look at the things I had brought, although I suggested several ways in which I intended to help her and make it possible for her to have a few friends of her own class who would make her forget her troubles. She just lay and stared at me and said quite impertinently that she didn't remember ever having met me. And when I mentioned your name, she denied ever having seen you. She even dared to ask me to leave the room, and the nurse was most insulting. But don't worry about it in the least, for Papa has promised to have the nurse removed at once from her position and blacklisted, so that she can't ever get another place in a decent hospital. I am afraid you will be disappointed in your protégée, and I am awfully sorry, for I would have enjoyed doing her good, but you see how impossible it was. You are not to feel put out that I was treated that way, for I really enjoyed doing something for you, and you know it is good for one to suffer sometimes. I'll be delighted to go slumming for you any time again that you say, and please don't mind asking me. It's much better for me to look after any girls that need help than it is for you, because girls of that sort are so likely to impose upon a young man's sympathies. My cousin has been telling me how you have been looking after some of the work of a student who is majoring in sociology. So I'm beginning to understand why you took this girl up. I do hope you'll let me help. Suppose you run over this evening and we can talk it over. I'm giving up 2 whole engagements to stay home for you. So I hope you will properly appreciate it. And if anything hinders your coming, would you mind calling up and letting me know? Hope to see you this evening. Your true friend and fellow worker, Hila Dare. The letter struck a false note in the harmony of the day. It annoyed Courtland beyond expression that he had made such a blunder as to send Hila after Bonnie. He could not understand why Hila had not had better discernment than to think Bonnie an object of charity. His indignation was still burning over the trouble and peril her action had brought to Bonnie, yet he hated to have his opinion of Hila shaken. He had arranged it in his mind that she was a sweet and lovely girl, one in every way similar to Solveig the Innocent, and he did not care to change it. He tried to remember Gila's conventional upbringing and realized that she had no conception of a girl out of her own social circle other than as menial to whom to condescend. The vision of her loveliness in rose and silver, with her prayer book in her kerchief, was still dimly forcing him to be at least polite and accept her letter of apology for her failure, as he could not suppose it was sincerely meant. Then, all at once, a new fact dawned upon him. The invitation had been for Saturday evening. This was Sunday evening. And now what was he to do? He might call her up and apologize, but what could he say? Bill Ward might have told her by this time that he knew the letter had been received. A blunt confession that he had forgotten to read it might offend, yet what else could he do? It was most annoying. He went to the telephone as soon as he reached the college.
The fellows had already gone down to the evening meal. He could hear the clink of china and silver in the distant dining room. It was a good time to phone. A moment and Gila's cool contralto answered, "Hello." There was something about the way that Gila said that word that conveyed a whole lot of things, instantly putting the caller at his distance, but placing the lady on a pedestal before which it became most desirable to bow. "This is Paul Courtland." "Oh, Mr. Courtland." Her voice was freezing. But Courtland was not used to being frozen out. "I owe you an apology, Miss Dare," he said with dignity. He didn't care how blunt he sounded now. It always angered him to be frozen. "Your letter reached me just as I was leaving here last evening on a very important errand. I put it in my pocket, but I have been so occupied that it escaped my mind utterly until just now. I hope I did not cause you much inconvenience." "Oh, it really didn't matter in the least," answered Gila indifferently. Nothing could be colder or more distant than her voice, and yet there was something in it this time, a subtle lure that exasperated. A teasing little something at his spirit demanded to be set right in her eyes, to have her the suppliant rather than himself. "I really am awfully ashamed," he said in quite a boyish, humble tone, and then gasped at himself. What was there about Gila that always got a fellow's goat? After that Gila had the conversation quite where she wanted it, and finally she told him sweetly that he might come over this evening if he chose. She had other engagements, but she would break them all for him. "Suppose you go to church with me this evening," he temporized. "I found a minister I'd like to have you hear. He's quite original." There was a distinct pause at the other end of the phone, while Gila's little white teeth came cruelly into her red under lip, and her pearly forehead drew the straight, black, penciled brows naughtily. Then she answered in sweetly honeyed tones: "Why, that would be lovely. Perhaps I will. What time do we start?" Something in her tone annoyed him, despite his satisfaction at having induced her to be friends again. Almost it sounded like a false note in the day again. He hadn't expected her to go. Now she was going. He was very sure he didn't want her. "I warn you that it is among very common people in the lower part of the city," he said almost severely. "Oh, that's all right," she declared graciously. "I'm sure it will be dandy. I certainly do enjoy new experiences." He hung up the phone with far greater misgivings than he had felt when he asked her to call on Bonnie. Bill Ward was called out of the dining room to the telephone almost as soon as Courtland got down to the table. It was Gila on the phone. "Is that you, Bill?" "Well, Bill, this is Gila. Say, what in the name of peace have you let me in for now? I hope to goodness Mama won't find it out. She'd have a pink fit. Say, is this a joke or what? I believe you're putting one over on me." "Search me, Gila. I'm all in the dark. Give me a line on it and I will tell you." "Well, what do you think that crazy nut has pulled off now? Wants me to go to church with him, of all things, and down in some queer slum place, too. If I get into a scrape you'll have to promise to help me out, or Moma'll never let me free from a chaperone again. And I had to make Artley Gulpin and Turner Bailey sore, too, by telling them I was sick and they couldn't come and try over those new dance steps to night as I'd promised. If I get into the papers or anything I'll have a long score to settle with you." "Oh, cut that out, Gila. You'll not get into any scrape with Court. He's all right. He's only nuts about religion just now, and seems to be set on sampling all kinds of churches. Say, that's a good one, though, for you to go to church with him. I must tell the fellows. Keep it up, Guile, old girl. You'll pull the fat out of the fire yet. You're just the one to go along and counteract the pious line. You should worry about Artley Gulpin and Turner Bailey. You can't keep either of them sore. They haven't got backbone enough to stay so. If it's the same dump Court took Henley to this morning, you'll get your money's worth all right. Nellie said it was a scream." Bill Ward came back grinning from ear to ear. Every few minutes during the rest of the meal he broke out in a broad grin and looked at Courtland, who was absorbed in his own thoughts, and then he would slap Tennelly on the shoulder and say, "Ooh, boy, it's a rare one." But it was not until Courtland had hurried away after his lady that Bill gave forth his information. "Oh, Nelly!" he burst forth. "Court's going to take Hila to church. You don't suppose he'll take her to that dump where he led you this morning, do you? I can see her nose go up now. I thought I'd croak when she told me. Wait till you hear her call me up on the phone when she gets home. She'll give me the worst bawling out I ever had. And Aunt Nina would have apoplexy if she knew her darling pet was going into that part of town. Oh, boy! Set me on my feet or I'll die laughing." Tennelly regarded Bill Ward with solemn consternation. "Do you mean to tell me that Courtland has asked your cousin to go to that camp meeting hole where he took me this morning? Cut out the kidding and tell me straight." "Well, then, Bill, it's serious, and we've got to do something. We can't have a fellow like Court spoiled for life. He's gone stale. That's what's the matter. He's gone stale. He's got to have strenuous measures to pull him up." "He sure has," said Bill Ward, soberly, getting up from the couch where he had been rolling in his mirth. "What can we do? What about these business ambitions of his? Couldn't we work him that way? For Court's got a great head on him, you know. I thought Hila would do the business, but if he's rung in religion on her it's all up, I'm afraid. But business is a different thing. Not even Court could mix business and religion, for they won't fit together." "That's the trouble," said Tennelly, thoughtfully. "If it gets out what's the matter with Court he won't stand half a chance. I was thinking of my Uncle Ramsey out in Chicago. He has large financial interests in the West. He often wants promising men to take charge of some big thing, and it means a dandy opening, big money, and no end of social and political pull to get into one of his berths. He's promised me one when I'm done college, and I was going to talk to him about Court. He's twice the man I am, and just what Uncle Ramsey wants. He's coming on East next week, and likely to stop over. I might see what I can do." "That's just the thing, Nelly. Go to it, old man. Write Unc a letter to night. Nothing like giving a lot of dope beforehand." "That's an idea. I will." And Tennelly went to his desk and began to write. Meantime, Hila awaited Courtland's coming, attired in a most startling costume of blue velvet and ermine, with high laced white kid boots and a hat that resembled a fresh white setting hen, tied down to her pert little face with a veil, whose large meshed surface was broken by a single design, a large black butterfly anchored just across her dainty little nose. A most astonishing costume in which to appear in the Reverend John Burns's unpretentious little church, crowded with the canaille of the city. It was the first time that Courtland had ever felt that Hila was a little loud in her dress. End of chapter 18. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 19 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mother Marshall got strenuously to her feet from the low hassock on which she had been sitting to sew the carpet and trotted to the head of the stairs. "Father!" she called happily. "Oh, Father, it's all done. I just set the last stitch. You can bring your hammer and tacks. Better bring your rubbers, too. You'll need them when you come to stretch it." Father hurried up so quickly it was clear he had the hammer and rubbers all ready. "You'll need a saucer to put the tacks in," and Mother Marshall hustled away to get it. When she came back the carpet was spread out smoothly, and Father stood surveying the effect. "Say now, it looks real pretty, don't it?" he said, looking up at the walls and down to the floor. "It certainly does," declared Mother Marshall, "and I'm real glad the man made us take this plain pink paper. It didn't look much to me when he first brought it out, I must confess. I had set my heart on stripes with pink roses in it. But when he said felt, why that settled it, because that article in the magazine said felt papers were the best for general wear and satisfaction.
And then when he brought out that roll with the cherry blossoms on it for a stripe around the top, I was just all happy down my spine. It did look so kind of bridey and pretty, like our cherry orchard on a spring evening when the pink is in the sky. All that white molding between 'em is going to be real handy to hang the pictures on. The man gave me some little brass picture hooks. See, they fit right over the molding. Of course, there isn't but one picture, but she'll maybe have some of her own and like it all the better if the wall isn't all cluttered full. You know the magazine said have a few good pictures. I mean to hang it up right now and see how it looks. There! Doesn't that look pretty against the pink? I wasn't sure about the white frame. It was so plain, but I like it. Those apple blossoms against that blue piece of sky look real natural, don't they? You like it, don't you, Father? Well, I should say I did, said Father as he scuffed a corner of the carpet into place with his rubbered feet. Say, this carpet is some thick, Mother, as I guess your fingers will testify, having sewed all those long seams. 'Member how Stevie used to sit on the carpet ahead of your seams when he was a baby, and laugh and clap his hands when you couldn't sew any further because he was in the way? Yes. Wasn't he the sweetest baby? Said Mother Marshall, with a bright tear glinting suddenly down her cheek. Why, Father, sometimes I can't really make it seem true that he's all done with this life and gone ahead of us into the next one. It won't be hard dying for us, because he's there, and we shan't have to think of leaving him behind to go through a lot of trials and things. Well, I guess he's pretty happy seeing you chirk up so, Mother. You know what he'd have thought of all this? Why, he'd have just rejoiced in it. He hated so to have you left alone all day. Don't you mind how he used to wish he had a sister? Say, Mother, you just stand on that corner there till I get this tack in straight. This edge is so tremendous thick. I don't know as the tacks are long enough. What was you figuring to do with the bookshelves? Put books in or leave 'em empty for her things? Well, I thought about that, and I made out we'd better put in some books so it wouldn't look so empty. We can take them out again if she has a lot of her own. We could put in some of Stephen's that he sets such store by. There's all that set of Scott and Dickens and those other fellows that he wanted us to start and read evenings this winter. By the way, Mother, we'd ought to get at that. Perhaps she'll like to read aloud when she comes. That would about suit us. We're rather old to begin loud reading. Steve's always read to us so long. I don't know but I'd buy a few new books, too. She's a girl, you know, and you might find something lately written that she'd like. It wouldn't do any harm to get a few. You could ask the bookstore man what to pick out. Say a shelf or two. Oh, I shouldn't need to do that, said Mother, hurrying away to get her magazine, which was never far away these last 2 or 3 days. There's a whole long list here of books your young people will want to have in their library. Wells and Shaw and Ibsen and a lot of others I never heard of, but these first 3 I remembered because Stephen spoke of them in one of his first letters about college. Don't you know he was studying a course with those men's books in it? He said he didn't know as he was always going to agree with all they said, but they were big, broad men and had some fine thoughts. He thought sometimes they hadn't just got the inner light about God and the Bible and all, but they were the kind of men who were getting there, striving after truth, and would likely find it and hand it out to the world again when they got it, like the wise men hunting everywhere for a Savior. Don't you remember, Father? I remember. Father tried to speak cheerily, but his breath ended in a sigh, for the carpet was heavy. Mother looked at him sharply and changed the subject. It wasn't always easy to keep Father cheerful about Stephen's going. You don't suppose we could get those curtains up tonight, too, do you? Why, I reckon, said Father, stopping for a puff of breath and looking up to the white woodwork at the top of the windows. You got 'em all ready to put on, all sewed and everything? Why, I reckon I could put up those rods after I got across this end, and then you could slip the curtains on while I was doing the rest. You don't want to get too tired, Mother. You know you've been sewing a long time to day. Oh, I'm not tired. I'm just childish enough to want to see how it's all going to look. Say, Father, that wasn't the telephone ringing, was it? You don't think we might get a telegram yet to night?" "Not scarcely," said Father, with his mouth full of tacks. "You see, it's been bad weather, and like as not your letter got storm stayed a day or so. You mustn't count on hearing 'fore Monday, I guess." They both knew that letter ought to have reached the hospital where Bonnie Brentwood was supposed to be about 6 o'clock that evening, for so they had calculated the time between Stephen's letters to a nicety. But each was engaged in trying to keep the other from getting anxious about the telegram that did not come, for it was now 8:30 by the kitchen clock, and both of them were as nervous as fleas listening for that telephone to ring that would decide the fate of the pretty pink room, whether it was to have an occupant or not. "These white madras curtains look like there's been a frost on a cobweb, don't they?" said Mother Marshall, holding up a pair all arranged upon the brass rod ready to hang. "And just see how pretty this pink stuff looks against it. I declare it reminds me of the sunset light on the snow in the orchard out the kitchen window evenings when I was watching for Steve to come home from school. Say, Father, don't you think those bookshelves look cozy each side of the bay window? And wasn't it clever of Jed Lewis to think of putting hinges to the covers on that window seat? She can keep lots of things in there. Wait till I get those 2 pink silk cushions you made me buy. My, Father, but you and I are getting extravagant in our old age, and all for a girl that may never even answer our letter." There was a kind of sob in the end of Mother Marshall's words that she tried to disguise, but Father caught it and flew to the rescue. "There now, Mother," he said, getting laboriously up from the carpet, hammer in hand, and putting his arms tenderly about her. "There now, Mother, don't you go fretting. You see, like as not she was asleep when the letter got there, and they wouldn't wake her up, or maybe it would be too much excitement for her at night that way. And then again, if the mail train was late it wouldn't get into the night delivery. You know that happened once for Steve, and he was real worried about us. Then they might not have delivery at the hospital on Sunday, and she couldn't get it till Monday morning. See? And there's another thing you got to calculate on, too. You never thought of that. She might be too sick yet to read a letter or think what to say to it. So just you be patient, Mother. We'll just have that much more time to fix things. For, so to speak, now we haven't got any limitations on what we think she is. We can just plan for her like she was perfect. When we get her telegram we'll get some idea and begin to know the real girl. But now we've just got our own notion of her." "Why, of course," choked Mother, smiling. "I'm just afraid, Seth, that I'm getting set on her coming, and that isn't right at all, you know, because she mightn't be coming. Well, and then again she might. Howsomenever we'll have this room fixed up company fine. And if she don't come we'll just come here and camp for a week, you and me, and pretend we're out visiting. How would that do? Say, it's real pretty here, like spring in the orchard, ain't it, Mother? Well, now, you figure out what you're going to have for bureau fixings, and I'll get back to my tacking. I want to get done to night and get that pretty white furniture moved in. You're sure the enamel is perfectly dry on that bed? That was the last piece he worked on. I think Jed made a pretty good job of it for such quick work, don't you? Got a clean counterpane and one of your pink and white patchwork quilts for in here, haven't you? And a posy pincushion? My, but I'd like to know what she says when she sees it first." And so the two old dears jollied each other along till far past their bedtime, and when at last they lay quiet for the night, Mother raised up in the moonlight that was flooding her side of the room and looked cautiously over to the other side of the bed. "Father, you awake yet?" "Yes," sleepily. "What'll we do about going to church to morrow? The telegram might come while we're gone, and then we'd never know what she answered." "Oh, they'd call up again until they got us. And anyhow, we'd call them up when we got back and ask if any message had come yet." "Oh, would we?" And Mother Marshall lay down for a sigh of relief, marveling, as she often had, at the superior knowledge in little technical details that men so often displayed.
Of course, in the real vital things of life, women had to be on hand to make things move smoothly. But just a little thing like that, now, that needed a bit of what seemed almost superfluous information, a man always knew, and you wondered how he knew, because nobody ever seemed to have taught him. So at last Mother Marshall slept. Anxious inquiry of the telephone after church brought forth no telegram. Dinner was a strained and artificial affair, preceded by a wistful but submissive blessing on the meal. Then the couple settled down in their comfortable chairs, one each side of the telephone, and tried to read, but somehow the hours dragged slowly. "There's that pair of Grandmother Marshall's andirons up in the attic," said Mother Marshall, looking up suddenly over the top of the Sunday school Times. "I'll bring them down the first thing in the morning," said Father, with his finger on a promise in the Psalms. Then there was silence for some time. Mother Marshall's eyes suddenly lighted on an article headed, "My Class of Boys." "Seth," she said, with a beautiful light in her eyes, "you don't suppose maybe she'd be willing to take Stephen's class of boys in Sunday school when she gets better? I can't bear to see them begin to stay away, and Deacon Grigsby admits he don't know how to manage them." "Why, sure," said Father, tenderly. "She'll take it, I've no doubt. She's that kind, I should think. And if she isn't now, Mother, she will be after she's been with you a while." "Oh, now, Father," said Mother, turning pink with pleasure. "Come, let's go up and see how the room looks at sunset." So arm in arm they climbed the front stairs and stood looking about on the glorified rosy background with its wilderness of cherry bloom about the frieze. Such a transformation of the dingy old room in such a little time! Arm in arm they went over to the window seat and sat leaning stiffly against the two pink silk cushions and looking out across the rosy sunset snow in the orchard, thinking wistfully of the boy that used to come whistling up that way and would never come to them so again. Then, just as Father drew a sigh and a tear crept out on Mother's cheek, the side next the window, a long hoped for, unaccustomed sound burst out below stairs. The telephone was ringing. It was Sunday evening at sunset, and the telephone was ringing. Wildly they both sprang to their feet and clutched each other for a moment. "I'll go, Mother," said Father in an agitated voice. "You just sit right here and rest till I get back." "No, I'll go too," declared Mother, trotting after. "You might miss something, and we ought to write it down." In breathless silence they listened for the magic words, Mother leaning close to catch them and trying to scratch them down on a corner of the telephone book with the stump of a pencil she kept for writing recipes. "Your wonderful invitation accepted with deep gratitude." "What's that, Father? Make him say it over again!" cried Mother, scribbling away. "Your wonderful invitation." Oh, she liked it then. "Accepted." "She's coming, Father." "We'll start as soon as possible." "Then she's really coming?" "Probably Wednesday night." "Then I'll have time to get some pink velvet and make a cushion for the little rocker. They do have pink velvet, I'm sure." "We'll write." "Then we'll really know what she's like if she writes." Mother Marshall's happy thoughts were in a tumult, but she had her head about her yet. "Now make him say it all over from the beginning again, Father, and see if we've got it right. You speak the words out as he says 'em, and I'll watch the writing." And so at last the message was verified and the receiver hung up. They read the message over together, and they looked at each other with glad eyes. "Now let us pray, Rachel," said Father with solemn, shaken voice of joy. And the two lonely old people knelt down by the little table on which stood the telephone and gave thanks to God for the child He was about to send to their empty home. "Now," said Father Marshall, when they had risen, "I guess we better get a bite to eat. Seems like a long time since dinner. Any of that cold chicken left, Mother? And a few doughnuts and milk? And say, Mother, we better get the chores done up and get to bed early. I don't think you slept much last night, and we've got to get up early. There's a whole lot to do before she comes. We need to chirk up the rest of the house a bit. Somehow we've let things get down since Stephen went away," said Mother as she landed the platter of cold chicken on the table. "How soon do you s'pose she'll write? I'm just aching to get that letter." End of chapter 19, recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 20 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hila had counted on an easy victory that evening. She had furnished for the occasion her keenest wit, her sweetest laughter, her finest derision, her most sparkling sarcasm, and as she and her escort joined the motley throng who were patiently making their way into the packed doorway, she whetted them forth eagerly. Even while they took their turn among the crowd, she began to make keen little remarks about the company they were keeping, drawing her velvet robes away from contact with the throng. Courtland, standing head and shoulders above her, his fine profile outlined against the brightness of the lighted doorway, was looking about with keen interest on the faces of the people and wondering why they had come. Were they in search of the Presence? Had they, too, felt it there within those dingy walls? He glanced down at Hila with a hope that she, too, might see and understand to-night. What friends they might be! How they might talk these things over together! If only Hila would understand! He wished she had had better sense than to array herself in such startling garments. He could see the curious glances turned her way, glances that showed she was misunderstood. He did not like it, and he reached down a protecting hand and took her arm, speaking to her gravely just to show the bold fellows behind her that she was under capable escort. He did not hear her keen sallies at the expense of their fellow worshipers. He was annoyed and trying by his serious mien to shelter her. The singing was already going on as they entered, just plain old gospel songs, sung just as badly, though with even more fervor than in the morning. Courtland accepted the tattered hymn book and put Hila into the seat the shabby usher indicated. He was wholly in the spirit of the gathering and anxious only to feel the spell once more that had been about him in the morning. But Hila was so amused with her surroundings that she could scarcely pay attention to where she was to sit, and almost tripped over the end of the pew. She openly stared and laughed at the people around her, as though that was what Courtland had brought her there for, and kept nudging him and calling his attention to some grotesque figure. Courtland was singing, joining his fine tenor in with the curious assembly, and enjoying it. Hila recalled him each time from a realm of the spirit, and he would earnestly give attention to what she said, bending his ear to listen, then look seriously at the person indicated, try to appreciate her amusement with a nod and absent smile, and go on singing again. He was so absorbed in the gathering that her talk scarcely penetrated to his real soul. If he had been trying to baffle Hila, he could have used no more effective method, for the point of her jokes seemed blunted. She turned her eyes at last to her escort and began to study him, astonishment and chagrin in her countenance. Gradually both gave way to a kind of admiration and curiosity. One could not look at Courtland and not admire. The fine strength in his handsome young face and figure were always noticeable among a company anywhere, and here among these foreigners and wayfarers it was especially so. She was conscious of a thrill of pleasure in his presence that was new to her. Usually her attitude was to make others thrill at her presence. No man before had caught her fancy and held it like this rare one. What secret lay behind that grave strength of his that made him successfully resist those arts of hers that had readily lured other victims? She watched him while he bowed his head in prayer, and noted how his rich, close-cut hair waved and crept about his temples, noted the curve of his chin and the curl of his lashes on his cheek. More and more she coveted him, and she must set herself to find and break this other power that had him in its clutches. She perfectly recognized the fact that it was entirely possible that she would not care for him after the other power was broken, and that she might have to toss him aside after he was fully hers. But what of that? Had she not so tossed many a hapless soul that had come like a moth to singe his wings in her candle flame, then laughed at him gaily as he lay writhing in his pain, and tossed after him, torn and trampled, his own ideals of womanhood too, so that all other women might henceforth be blighted in his eyes? Ah, what of that? So that unquenchable flame in her soul, that restlessly pursued and conquered and cast aside, might be satisfied. Was that not what women were made for? To conquer men and toss them away? If they did not, would not men conquer them and toss them away? She was but fulfilling her womanhood as she had been taught to look upon it. But there was something puzzling about Courtland that interested her deeply. She was not sure but it was half his charm. He really seemed to want to be good, to desire to resist evil. Most of the other men she knew had been all too ready to fall as lightly, with as little earnestness, as she into whatever doubtful paths her dainty feet had chanced to lead. Many of them would have led further than she would go, for she had her own limitations and conventions, strange as it may seem. So Gila sat and meditated with a strange, sweet thrill in the thought of a new experience, for, young as she was, she had found the pleasures of her existence pall upon her many times. Suddenly her ear was caught by the sermon. The ugly little man in the pulpit, with the strange eyes that seemed to look through you, was telling a story of a garden with one calling, and a pair of naked souls guilty and in fear before him. It was as though she had been one of them. What right had he to flaunt such truths before a congregation? She was not familiar enough with Bible truths to know where he got the story. It did not seem a story. It was just her Eden, where she walked and ate what fruit she might desire every day without a thought of any command that might have been issued. She recognized no commands. What right had God to command her? The serpent had whispered early to her, "Thou shalt not surely die." Her only question was ever whether the fruit was pleasant to the eyes and a tree to be desired to make one wise. Till now there had been no Lord God walking in her garden in the cool of the day, only her mother, and she was easy to evade. She had never been really afraid, nor felt her little soul naked till now, with the ugly little man's bright brown eyes upon her, and his words shivering through her like winds about the unprotected. Hideous things she had forgotten flung into view and challenged her, and somewhere in the room there seemed to be one who dared to call her to account. She looked fiercely back to the speaker, her delicate brows drawn darkly, her great blue-black eyes fierce in their intensity, her whole face and attitude a challenge to the sermon. Courtland, absorbed as he was in what the speaker had to say, thrilling with the message that came to his soul welcomely, became aware of the tense little figure by his side, and looking down, was pleased that she had forgotten her nonsense and was listening, and somehow missed the defiance in her attitude. Gila did not smile when service was over. She went out haughtily, impatiently, looking about on the throng contemptuously. When Courtland asked her if she would like to stop a minute and meet the preacher, she threw up her chin with a toss and a "No, indeed!" that left no doubt for lingering. Out in the street, away from the crowd somewhat, she suddenly stopped and stamped her little foot. "I think that man is perfectly disgusting!" she cried. "He ought to be arrested. I don't know why such a man is allowed at large." She was fairly panting in her anger. It was as if he had put her to shame before an assembly. Courtland turned wonderingly toward her. "He is outrageous!" she went on. "He has no right! I hate him!" Courtland watched her in amazement. "You can't mean the minister?" "Minister!" "He's no minister," declared Hila. "He's a fanatic, one of the worst kind. He's a fake. He's uncanny. The idea of daring to talk about God that way, as if He was always around everywhere! I think it's awful. I should think he'd have everybody in hysterics." Gila's voice sounded as if she were almost there herself. She flung along by his side with a vindictive little click of her high-heeled boots and a prance of her whole elaborate little person that showed she was fairly bristling with wrath. But Courtland's voice was sad with disappointment. "Then you didn't feel it after all? I was hoping you did." "Feel what?" she asked, sharply. "I felt something, yes. What did you mean?" Her voice had softened wonderfully, and she drew near to him and slipped her hand again within his arm. There was an eagerness in her voice that Courtland wholly misinterpreted. "Feel the Presence!" He said it gently, reverently, as if it were a magic word, a password to a mutual understanding. "Presence?" she said, bewildered. "Yes, I felt a presence, but what presence did you mean?" Her voice was soft and meaning. "The presence of God." She turned upon him and jerked her arm away. "The presence of God in that place?" she demanded. "No, never! How perfectly dreadful! I think that is irreverent." "Irreverent?" "Yes, very irreverent," said Gila, piously. "And a man like that is profaning holy things. If you really care for religious things you ought to come to my church, where everything is quiet and orderly and where there are decent people. Why, those people there to night looked as if they might all be thieves and murderers! And outlandish! My soul! I never saw anything like it. Some of their things must have come out of the ark. Did you see that girl with the tight green skirt? Imagine it! A whole year and a half out of date. I think it is immodest to wear things when they get out of style like that. And the idea of that man daring to talk to that kind of people about God coming down to live with them! I think it was the limit. As if God cared anything about people of that sort! I think that man ought to be arrested, putting notions into poor people's heads. It's just such talk as that that makes riots and things. My father says so. Getting common, stupid people all worked up about things they can't understand. I think it's wicked." Gila raved all the way home. Courtland, for the most part, let her talk and was silent. Seated finally in the library, for he could not go away yet, somehow, there was something he must ask her. He turned to her, calling her for the first time by her name. "But Gila, you said you felt a presence. What did you mean?" Gila was silent. The tumult in her face subsided. She dropped her lashes and played with the frill on the wrist of the long chiffon sleeve of her blouse. Her eyes beneath their concealing lashes kindled. Her mouth grew sweet and sensitive. Her whole attitude became shy and alluring. She sat and drooped before the fire, casting now and then a wide, shy, innocent look up, her face half turned away. "Does she look adown her apron?" floated the words through his brain. Ah, here at last was the Gila he had been seeking, the Gila who would understand. "Tell me, Gila," he said in an eager, low appeal. She stirred softly, drooped a little more toward him, her face turned away till only the charming profile showed against the rich darkness of a crimson curtain. Now at last he was coming to it. "It was you I meant," she breathed softly. He sat up sharply. There was subtle flattery in her tone. He could not fail to be stirred by it. "Me?" he said, almost sternly. "I don't understand." But his voice was gentle, almost tender. She looked so small and scared and Slovene like. "You meant me," he said again. "Won't you please explain?" End of chapter 20. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 21 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill.
recording is in the public domain. Courtland went back to college that night in a tender and exalted mood. He thought he was in love with Hila. That had been a wonderful little scene before the fire, with the soft, hidden yellow lights above, and Hila with her delicate, fervid little face, great dark eyes, and shy looks. Hila had risked a tear upon her pearly cheek and another to hang upon her long lashes, and he had had a curious desire to kiss them away, but something held him from it. Instead, he took his clean handkerchief, softly wiping them, and thought that Hila was shy and modest when she shrank from his touch. He did not take her in his arms. Something held him from that, too. He had a feeling that she was too scared, and he must not lightly snatch her for himself. Instead, he put her gently in the big chair by his side, and they sat and talked together quietly. He did not realize that he had done the most of the talking. He did not know what they had talked about, only that reluctant whispered confession of hers had somehow entered him into a close intimacy with her that pleased and half awed him. But when he tried to tell her of a wonderful experience he had had, she lifted up her little hand and begged, "Please, not to night. Let us not think of anything but just each other to night." And so he had let it pass, knowing she was all wrought up. He had not asked her to marry him, nor even told her he loved her. They had talked in quiet, wondering eyes, of feeling drawn to each other. At least he had talked, and Gila had sat watching him with deep, dissatisfied eyes. She had sense enough to see that she could not win him with the arts that had won others. He was a nature deeper, stronger. She must bide her time and be coy. But her spirit chafed beneath delay, and dark passions lurked behind and brooded in her eyes. Perhaps it was this that held him in a sort of uncertainty. It was as if he waited permission from some unseen source to take what she was so evidently ready to give. He thought it was the sacredness in which he held her. Almost the sermon and the feeling of the Presence were out of mind as he went home. There played around him now a little phantom joy that hovered over like a will-o'-wisp above his heart and danced, giving him a strange, inexplicable exhilaration. Was this love? Was he in love? He flung himself down on Tennelly's couch when he got back to the dormitory. Bill Ward was deep in a book under the drop light, and Tennelly was supposed to be finishing a theme for the next day. "Nelly, what is love?" asked Courtland, suddenly, in the midst of the silence. "How do you know when you are in love?" Tennelly dropped his fountain pen in his surprise and had to crawl under the table after it. He and Bill Ward exchanged one lightning glance of relief as he emerged from the table. "Search me!" said Tennelly, as he sat down again. "Love's an illusion, they say. I never tried it, so I don't know." There was silence again in Tennelly's room. Presently Courtland got up and said good night. Over in his own room he stood by the window looking out into the moonlight. The preacher had said prayer was talking with the Lord face to face. That was a new idea. Courtland dropped upon his knees and talked aloud to God as he had never opened his heart to a living creature before. If prayer was that, why prayer was good. Gila, standing bewildered, studying her pretty, discontented little face in the mirror, with all its masks laid aside, would have shivered in fear and been all the more uncertain of her success if she could have known that the man she would have had for a lover was on his knees talking about her to God, her little naked soul in a garden all alone with the Lord God, and a man who was set to follow him. Tennelly looked up and raised his eyebrows as Courtland closed the door. "Guess you needn't have written that letter after all," chuckled Bill Ward. "I thought Gila would get in her little old work." "Well, it's written and mailed, so that doesn't do any good now. And anyway, it's always well to have more than one string to your bow," growled Tennelly. Courtland in love! He wasn't exactly sure he liked it. Courtland and Gila!
What kind of a girl was Hila anyway? Was she good enough for Court? He must look into this. Say, Bill, why don't you introduce me to your cousin? I think it's about time I had a chance to judge for myself how things are getting on, growled Tennelly presently. Sure, said Bill. Good idea. Why didn't you mention it before? How about going now? It's only 10:30. Court didn't stay very late, did he? No, it isn't too late for Hila. She never goes to bed till midnight. Not if there's anything interesting on. Wait, I'll call her up and see. I'm privileged anyway, you know. Cousins do anything. I'll tell her we're hungry. So it came about that an hour after Hila had sat in the firelight with Courtland and listened, puzzled, to his reverent talk of a soul friendship, she ushered into the same room her cousin and Tennelly. She met Tennelly with a challenge in her eye. Tennelly had one in his. Their glances lingered, sparred, and lingered again, and each knew that this was a notable meeting. For Tennelly was tall and strikingly handsome. He had those deep black eyes that hold a maiden's gaze and dare a devil. Yet there was behind his look something strong, dashing, scholarly. Hila saw at once that he was distinguished in his way, and though her thoughts were strangely held by Courtland, she could not let one like this go by unchallenged. If Courtland did not prove corrigible, why, there was still as good a fish in the sea as ever was caught. It were well to have more than one hook baited. So she received Tennelly graciously, boldly, impressively, and in 3 minutes was talking with that daring intimacy that young people of her style love to affect. And Tennelly, fascinated by her charms, yet seeing through them and letting her know he saw through them, was fencing with her delightfully. He told himself it was his duty for Courtland's sake, yet he was interested for his own sake and he knew it. But he did not like the idea of Court and this girl. They did not fit. Court was too genuine, too tender-hearted, too idealistic about women. With himself, now, it was different. He knew women, understood this one at a glance. She was a peach in her way, but not the perfect little peach Court ought to have. She would flirt all her life and break old Court's heart if he married her. So he laughed and joked with Hila, answering her challenging glances with glances just as ardent, while Bill Ward sat and watched them both chuckling away to himself. And Courtland, on his knees, talked with God. The next morning Courtland awoke with a pleasant sensation of eagerness to see what life had in store for him. Was this really the wonderful experience of love into which he had begun to enter? He thought of Hila all in halos now. The questionings and unpleasantnesses were forgotten. He told himself that she would one day see and understand the wonderful experience through which he had been passing. He would tell her just as soon as possible. Not to day, for he would be busy, and she had engagements Tuesday evening and all day Wednesday. He had not noticed the subtle withdrawing as she told him, the quick, furtive calculation in her glance. She knew how to make coming to her a privilege. Just because she had let him think he saw a bit of her heart that night, she meant to hold him off. Not too long, for he was not sufficiently bound to her to be safe from forgetting, but just long enough to whet his eagerness. Her former experience in such matters had taught her to expect that he would probably call her up and beg to see her sooner, when she might relent if he was humble enough. And she had not misjudged him. He was looking forward to Thursday as a bright, particular goal, planning what he would say to her, wondering if his heart would bound as it had when she looked at him Sunday night, and if the strange sweetness that seemed about to be settling upon him would last. Before he left his room that morning he did something he had never done before in college. He locked his door and knelt beside his bed to pray, with a strong, sweet sense of the Presence standing beside him and breathing power into his soul. He had not much to ask for himself. He simply craved that Presence, and it had never seemed so close. As he unlocked his door and hurried down the hall to the dining room, he marveled that a thing so sweet had been so long neglected from his life. Prayer! How he had sneered at it! Yet it was a reasonable thing after all, now that he had come believing. Nurse Wright was on hand promptly at the place appointed. She was armed with a list of written instructions. They went to work at once, setting aside the things to be sold, folding and packing the scanty wardrobe, and putting by themselves the clothes and things that had belonged to little Aleck. One incident brought tears to their eyes. In moving out the trunk a large pasteboard box fell down, and the contents dropped upon the floor. The nurse stooped to pick up the things, some pieces of an old overcoat of fine, dark blue material, cut into small garments, basted, ready to be sewed. A tissue paper pattern in a printed envelope marked "Boy's Suit." Courtland lifted up the cover to put it on again, and there they saw in a child's stiff little printing letters the inscription, "Aleck's new Sunday suit," and underneath, like a subtitle, in smaller letters, "Made out of Father's best overcoat." "Poor little kid!" said Courtland. "He never got to wear it." "He's wearing something far better," said the nurse, cheerfully. "And think what he's been spared. He'll never know the lack of a new suit again." Courtland looked at her thoughtfully. "You believe in the resurrection, don't you?" "I certainly do," said the nurse. "If I didn't I'd get another job. I couldn't see lives go out the way I do, and those left behind suffering, and not go crazy, if I didn't believe in the resurrection. You are a college student. I suppose you've got beyond believing things. It isn't the fashion to believe in God and the Bible any more. I understand, not if you're supposed to have any brains. But I thank God He's left me the resurrection, and when you come to face the loss of those you love, you'll wish you believed in it too." "But I do," said Courtland quietly, making his second confession of faith. "I never thought much about it till lately. It goes along with a Christ, of course. There had to be a resurrection if there was a Christ." "Well, I certainly am glad there's one college student that has some sense," said the nurse, looking at him with admiration. "I guess you had a good mother." "No," said Courtland, shaking his head. "I never knew my own mother. That'll be one of the things for me to look forward to in the resurrection. I was like all the rest of the fellows, thought I knew it all, and didn't believe anything till something happened. I was in a fire, and one of the fellows died. He was a great Christian, and I saw his face when he died. And then afterward, maybe you'll think I'm nuts when I tell you, but Christ came and stood by me in the smoke and talked with me, and I knew Him. He's been with me more or less ever since." The nurse looked at him curiously, a strange light in her eyes. Then she turned suddenly and looked out of the little window to the vista of gray roofs. "No, I don't think you're nuts," she said, brusquely. "I think you're the only sensible man I've met in a long time. It stands to reason if there is a Christ He'd come to people that way sometimes. I never had any vision or anything that I know of, but I've always known in my heart there was a Christ, and He was helping me. I couldn't answer their arguments, those smart aleck young doctors and the nurses that talked so much, but I always felt nobody could upset my belief, even if the whole world turned against Him, for I knew there was a Christ. I don't know how I know it, but I know it, and that's enough for me. I don't boast of being much of a Christian myself, but if I didn't know there was a Christ I couldn't stand the life I have to live, nor the disappointments that I've had." There were tears rolling down her cheeks, but her eyes were shining when she turned around. "Say, I guess we're sort of relations, aren't we?" laughed Courtland, holding out his hand. "You've described my feelings exactly." She took the offered hand and gripped it warmly. "I knew you must be different somehow when you went out to hunt for my patient so late at night that way," she said. Courtland went out presently, bringing back a second-hand man with whom he made a quiet bargain that not even the nurse could hear, and the surplus furniture was carted away. It was not long before the little room was dismantled and empty. They went together to a department store and purchased a charming little bag with a lot of traveling accessories in plain, compact form, light enough for an invalid to carry. Courtland begged to be let in on the gift, but the nurse was firm. "This is my picnic, young man," she said. "You're doing enough. You can't deny it. For pity's sake, wait till you know her better before you try to do any more." "Do you think I'll ever know her any better?" laughed Courtland. "If you have any sense you will," snapped back the nurse, and waved a grim but pleasant good bye as she took the trolley back to the hospital. Wednesday night Courtland was on hand with his car in plenty of time to take Bonnie and the nurse down to the station. He was almost startled at the beauty of the girl as she came slowly down the steps. There were certain little details of her costume that showed the hand of the nurse. A soft white collar, a floating, sheltering veil, gathered up now about the black sailor hat, well-fitting gloves, shoes polished like new. All these things made a difference and set off the girl's lovely face in its white resignation to an almost unearthly beauty. He found himself wanting to turn back often and look again as he drove his car through the crowded evening streets. She looked so frail and sweet he could not help thinking of Mother Marshall and how she would feel when she saw her. Surely she could not help but take her to her heart. He felt a certain pride in her, as if she were his sister. He was half sorry she was going away. He would like to know her better. The words of the nurse, "until you know her better," floated through his mind. What a strange thing that had been for her to say! It wasn't in the least likely that he would ever see Bonnie again. They left her in the sleeper with special instructions to the porter to look after her, and surrounding her with magazines and fruit. "She looks as if a breath might blow her away," said Courtland, speaking out of a troubled thought as he and the nurse stood on the platform watching the train move off. "Do you think she'll get through the journey all right?" "Sure," said the nurse, wiping away a wistful tear furtively. "She's got lots of pep. She'll rally and get strong pretty soon. She's had a pretty tough time the last 2 years. Lost her mother, father, a sister, and this little brother. Her father's heart was broken by being asked to leave his church because he preached temperance too much. The martyrs in this world didn't all die in the dark ages. They're having them yet." "But she looks so ethereal," pursued Courtland. "I wish I'd thought to suggest you going along. We could have trumped up some reason why you had to have a vacation." "Couldn't do it," said the nurse, smiling and patting his arm. "I thought of it, but it wouldn't work. I have to be at the hospital to morrow for a very important operation. There isn't anybody else in the hospital could very well take my place. Besides, she's sharp as a tack, and you needn't think she doesn't see through a lot of the things you've done for her. Mark my words, you'll hear from her some day. She means to know the truth about those bills and pay every cent back. But don't you worry about her. She'll get through all right. She's got more nerve than any dozen girls I know, and she doesn't go alone through this world either. She's had a vision, too, or you'd never see her wearing that patient face with all she's had to bear." "Did it ever seem strange to you that good people have so much trouble in this world?" said Courtland, voicing his same old doubting thought. "Well, now why? What's trouble going to be in the resurrection? We won't mind then what we passed through, and this world isn't forever, thank the Lord. If it's serving His plan any for me to get more than what seems my share of trouble, why, I'm willing, aren't you? The trouble is we can't see the plan, and so we go fretting because it doesn't fit our ideas. If it was our plan, now we'd patiently bear everything, I suppose, to make it come out right. We aren't up high enough to get the whole view of the finished plan, so of course lots of things look like mistakes. But if we trust Him at all, we know they aren't. And sometime, I suppose, we'll see the whole and then we'll understand why it was. But I never was one to do much fretting because I didn't understand. I always know what my job is, and that's enough. I'm content to trust the rest to God. It's a God-sized job to run the universe, and I know I'm not equal to it." Her simple logic calmed his restless thoughts, but there was still a strange wistfulness in his heart about Bonnie. She looked so white and resigned and sad. He wished she hadn't gone quite so far out of his life. Meantime, out in the darkness of the night Bonnie's train whirled along, and sometime during the long hours between midnight and dawning it passed in a rush and a thunder of sound the express that was bearing back to Courtland another menace to his peace of mind. End of chapter 21. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana.